Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Blue Collar DM. My name is Howard as always, and today we're actually going to be looking at monsters in Dungeons & Dragons and how we can look at their stat block in order to inform us on how to use them in our games. Let's get to it. In order to run monsters effectively in Dungeons & Dragons, we have to ask ourselves a couple of different questions. Where are the players? What's the environment like? Are they in the desert somewhere, or are they in some subterranean cave system where they're going to run into certain monsters as opposed to others? When we can answer these questions about the environment, it'll inform our decisions about which kinds of monsters we should run. Another thing we need to look at when we're considering which monsters to run is actually the monster stat block. Now, the stat block can be very confusing when we first look at one for the very first time, and I'm actually going to include one right up here so you can follow along with me as we keep going through this video. The monster stat block is going to actually give us a ton of different information that we need to know about in order to be able to run our game effectively. For example, some of the things that it talks about is actually the size. We need to know how big a monster is. Is it small, medium, large, or gargantuan? It'll also tell us what type of monster we're dealing with in the monster stat block. Is it an aberration or a beast, a construct, a humanoid, a dragon? There's a ton of different types of enemies, but the most important thing that we need to learn is what kind of enemy is it, so that way we know which ones to use to throw at our players depending on their environment, again, which is very important. Another thing the monster stat block can tell us is actually the alignment of the monster, whether it's lawful, neutral, chaotic, good, bad, evil, or neutral. These are important factors to consider depending on which environment, again, your players are involved in. Are they in the Nine Hells and they're going to be running into a lot of lawfully evil types of demons and other demonic creatures? Or are they going to be somewhere amongst the gods and they're going to be dealing with a lot of celestial beings that are going to be typically good beings, and depending on the balance of your party, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. The other thing that the monster stat block is going to give us is a lot of the various different statistics that we're going to need to know in order to run that particular monster in a given combat situation when we're in initiative. So some of the things that we'll need to know, obviously, are going to be the monster's armor class. I say obviously, but this is for a first-time DM, so forgive me. But again, armor class, we're going to need to know that. We're going to need to know the monster's hit points. And now there's actually a kind of a weird way that it's calculated in Dungeons & Dragons. In parentheses, you'll actually see the monster's stereotypical average hit points that are given. But you can also roll for those hit points by rolling the dice and then adding the Constitution modifier. Another thing that the monster stat block is going to give us is actually the monster's speed. Now, some monsters have different speeds depending on what they're doing. There's a walking speed, there's swim speed, there's climbing speed, there's flying speed. There's a lot of different ones. But if a monster specifically has that particular type of speed, it'll be depicted here on the monster stat block as well. Another thing that we actually look at when we're looking at the stat block is actually ability scores and also saving throw modifiers. That'll tell us a lot of information when they're going to attack our players or if our players are going to attack them. The types of modifiers we're going to need in order to be able to inform what our dice are showing us. Another thing the monster stat block is going to tell us is any skill proficiencies a monster might have, say stealth or perception. Now these are going to be really important to inform us as dungeon masters on exactly how we're going to run these monsters in our game outside of combat, because certain monsters are going to be more perceptive than others and characters aren't going to be as easily able to stealth up and sneak up on these characters. So rogues may not be able to get their surprise attack depending on the situation. Another thing the stat block will tell us is also different senses that they have. Now, things like blind sight, dark vision, tremor sense, or true sight are going to be important to know because it's going to impact how an encounter goes. If a particular monster has tremor sense, while it might be blinded, it might still know where the characters are because it can feel them walking around on the ground. More things we need to know: languages. Are monsters able to communicate with the players depending on what it is? If it's a humanoid, do they know common? If it's a goblin and they speak goblinoid, do we have anybody in our party that can speak goblinoid that might impact how the encounter might go? Do they have the ability to communicate telepathically and talk to one player versus another and maybe influence an RP situation? Do they have any weird special traits like innate spellcasting or just general spellcasting overall? Now, innate spellcasting is a little bit different than general spellcasting. Innate spellcasting, monsters typically can only spend spells at the level that they're shown on their character sheets or on their monster stat block. So if they have a level 1 Cure Wounds, they can only cast it at level 1, versus if a monster just has regular spellcasting, they can cast it depending on what kind of spell slot they have. Another thing that the stat block will show us is actually any actions that the monster can take. So, for example, melee or ranged attacks, if they have any ammunition, if they have multi-attack, if they have any specific kinds of abilities that they can use. So limited usage abilities that are used a certain number of times per day, or ones that recharge on a certain dice roll, or recharge on a short or long rest. We'll also learn about the equipment that the monster's holding onto. So maybe they've got some like weird trap mechanisms, like maybe they have ball bearings or caltrops that they're carrying with them that could influence combat, or maybe they're wearing a specific kind of armor we need to know about, and maybe certain spells will impact that armor. These are important things to know because while they may not be important for one encounter, they may be important for another one. The other thing we need to know about is whether or not a monster is a legendary creature or not. If it's a legendary creature, it's going to have legendary actions. It's going to have lair actions. It's going to have regional effects on the area depending on what kind of monster it is. And we're going to need to know these things because legendary creatures are allowed to act outside of their initiative order because of that legendary action feature that they have. And depending on the lair that they're in, if we're fighting in a monster's lair that's a legendary creature, the environment might have something to say about what's going on in the combat during certain initiative orders. So we really need to know a lot about the monsters that we're running in order to be able to inform how they're going to impact the combat with our players. The other thing we need to look at on the monster stat block that we haven't addressed yet so far is actually challenge rating. Now, challenge rating can be kind of controversial depending on who you talk to, but it's a general guide on what kind of character level should be encountering these monsters. And these challenge ratings are typically calculated for a party of 4 player characters at that whatever level it is that the monster is, but that's only to fight that one monster. So that's why there's challenge ratings that vary all the way from 1/4 all the way up to 25, depending on what kind of monster you're running. And these are going to have a huge impact on how we decide to build our encounters. Because of the complicated nature of challenge rating and understanding the experience gained when we're actually dealing with monsters in our game, we're actually going to save the encounter building video for later on this week because I want to make sure that I give a good enough amount of depth to that discussion and make sure that we have a comprehensive understanding of what it means to build an encounter, how many encounters you should have in a given day, and how challenging they should be for your players, because I don't want to go too brief on that. It's a very important skill that we need to learn, and I don't feel like it would be a very good service to you guys to kind of squeeze this in at the very end of this video. Still, I do hope that you gain a lot from this video and you have a good understanding of what monsters are, what kind of types they are, where you should be considering to throw monsters depending on the environment, understanding the monster stat block and how to read it, and all the other things that we talked about earlier in this video. If you have any questions though, please leave a comment down below about anything that we talked about in this video or anything else Dungeons & Dragons. If you have any feedback on the video, I would love to see it down there because it gives me a better idea of what I need to do better in order to be able to curate this content to you guys, because at the end of the day, this is all for you guys. This isn't for me. This is all for you. I want to make sure that you guys get the experience you need out of these videos. And like I said, that video on encounter building is going to come out later this week, and we're going to go really good and in depth on that one. So make sure you subscribe to the channel so you get notified when that thing comes out. Until then, guys, I'll see you all in the next video.